Throughout the Cold War, the United States claimed the moral high ground as a bastion of freedom, equality, and choice. They would criticize the USSR for its human rights record, lack of political freedoms, and its failure to provide for the growth of its citizens. But there was one thing which the Soviets could always respond with: the treatment of ethnic minorities in the United States, particularly black people. The US's treatment of black people, as well as support for colonial regimes oppressing people of color, would frequently stand out as a monument to the hypocrisy of the moral argument Washington tried to make. But black Americans were not and were never passive victims in their oppression. Today, we're going to talk about how they fought back, because in order to grasp the full picture of the Cold War struggle, it is essential to know what's going on at home in America as well as abroad. I'm your host David, and this video is going to be our too short, too simplified story of the Civil Rights Movement in the early Cold War years. This is the Cold War. There's no real way to start this story without talking about slavery. For hundreds of years, long before the American Revolution, the land which would become the United States practiced the slavery of African people. And for the first 7 decades of American history, slavery persisted, contributing greatly to much of the wealth which would aid in the industrialization and expansion of that new country. Enslaved hands helped build the United States into the country it is today. A massive portion of the raw working hours which built America came from people considered property strictly because of the color of their skin. That is, until tensions about whether to expand slavery as the country continued to conquer and incorporate indigenous territory to the West exploded into a civil war, which, to this date, is still the deadliest war in American history. The end of the US Civil War resulted in a constitutional amendment ending slavery. However, they decided that even though so much of America's wealth came from the unpaid labor of these newly freed citizens, they saw no reason to share any of that wealth. Between lack of political will, terrorism from white supremacists, and political compromises to hold on to power, the South was, within a couple of decades of the end of the war, primarily run by the same people who ruled before the war, and black people continued to live as second-class citizens, often forced to work for the same families who had previously enslaved them. The lack of social movement and opportunity for black people in the South led to a mass movement to urban centers in the North in what has become known as the Great Migration. And this entire time, they fought and struggled for their rights. Historians distinguish the centuries-long struggle for freedom and equality, which persists today, as the long civil rights movement, and the concentrated movement of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as the short civil rights movement. That short civil rights movement is what we're talking about today. The basis for the short civil rights movement came from 2 major legal decisions which ruled unconstitutional the segregation of services in the southern states. At this time, nearly every aspect of society was structured to keep whites and non-white people separated. They also ensured that services and areas for non-white people, especially black people, were inferior. Segregation ran up and down society, from restaurants to public transit to, famously, water fountains. As well, governments in the US, but especially in the South, intentionally curtailed the right to vote for people of color. Poll taxes and literacy tests were intentionally designed and selectively enforced to prevent black people from voting. Collectively, these were the Jim Crow laws. And when they couldn't stop black people from trying to exercise their rights with legislation, there was always random acts of terrorism, murder, and lynching. For any who may not know, lynching is a practice of vigilante justice where a white mob would come together to murder someone, overwhelmingly someone who was not white, for undefined crimes or violations of the social code based on the flimsiest or often completely fabricated evidence. Law enforcement often looked the other way during these actions. So, with that being the life for black people in the South, what began the short civil rights movement? Well, several organizations on the ground had been working for decades since the end of slavery to push for more civil rights for black Americans. One opportunity for them to make significant progress arrived in the Supreme Court decision Morgan versus Virginia in 1946. In 1944, Irene Morgan was returning to her job in Baltimore, Maryland, from her mother's house in Virginia. She refused to move to the back of the bus when directed by the bus driver, since segregation was not allowed on interstate travel. She was then arrested and charged with resisting arrest, as well as violating Jim Crow laws. Although she pled guilty and was fined for resisting arrest, she refused to accept the Jim Crow charges and appealed the case all the way to the Supreme Court. In a 7-1 ruling, Irene Morgan's appeal was upheld, and the enforced segregation of interstate buses was deemed unconstitutional, opening the door for ruling more and more segregation laws as also unconstitutional. This case succeeded with the hard work of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a civil rights group started in 1909. However, the decision was wholly ignored, forcing a targeted movement to dismantle segregationist policies. In 1951, a group of black students protested the inferior conditions of the segregated black school system in Topeka, Kansas. The NAACP joined the students and pushed for a case to come before the Supreme Court to desegregate the school system. These cases amalgamated into what came before the Supreme Court as the famous case Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The court decided unanimously that, quote, segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. The court ordered segregation of schools to be phased out, quote, with all deliberate speed, a timeline vague enough that southern states could drag their heels for as long as they could. The fight was only beginning. The movement then turned into one with national and even international attention with the murder of a child. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old teenager from Chicago who was visiting his family in Mississippi. He allegedly wolf-whistled at a white woman who later admitted that she lied about the incident. Her husband and his brother proceeded to kidnap, beat, and mutilate the teen before fatally shooting him and throwing his body in a river. Emmett's mother, who had come to identify the remains of her teenage son, decided that the world had to see what these monsters had done to her child. So, despite his condition, his mother held an open casket funeral for him in Chicago. Historians consider the pictures of the brutalized remains of Emmett Till a real turning point in the civil rights movement, as white suburbanites across the country saw what the system of injustice and horror they were content to ignore really looked like. One person who could not shake the image of seeing such an innocent life ended by the brutal violence of white supremacy was a civil rights activist named Rosa Parks. Parks would be the spark of a massive movement only 100 days after Till's death. In Montgomery, Alabama, the public bus system was, like most public services in the city, racially segregated. Black riders had to sit in the back seats. There was already friction in the air from an incident where a black teenager named Claudette Colvin was arrested for refusing to sit at the back of one of these Montgomery buses. Counter to many myths built around her, Rosa Parks was not just a tired woman on her way home from work. Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. She knew exactly what she was doing as she, 9 months after Colvin, sat at the front of a Montgomery bus and refused to move, causing her arrest. The local NAACP chapter was interested in non-violent direct action work to fight segregation in Montgomery. Using the attention drummed up by the arrest of Rosa Parks, they organized a boycott of the bus system. Until segregation ended on the buses, they refused to ride them. They blanketed the city in leaflets calling for them to opt out as well, and they came through. Nearly all of Montgomery's sizable black community supported the boycott and held out for over a year. The bus service's fare revenue collapsed. Eventually, the matter came before the Supreme Court, and in Browder versus Gale, they ordered Montgomery to desegregate the buses, and the boycott ended. This event is often called the spark of the civil rights movement, and the success of the Montgomery bus boycott indeed led activists to know that they could win victories. The machine set up to maintain the boycott continued under the name of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and its first president was a powerful orator and major organizer of the boycott, a minister who we just might hear about a bit more through this series, a man named Martin Luther King Jr. Now, thinking back to the earlier Brown v. Board of Education ruling, which declared, quote, with all deliberate speed. By 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the local Little Rock Central High School was only beginning to address the contentious integration of students in order to comply with the Supreme Court ruling. But the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, however, had different plans. On September 4th, he ordered the National Guard to prevent 9 black children from going to school after they sued to attend. It was a marked attempt to force the issue of school integration. Years after Brown v. Board, Southern states were still refusing to desegregate their schools. These 9 students had the best grades, and there was no academic reason to bar their admission to Little Rock Central. The backlash against this was immense. Of the 9 students slated to attend school, 8 had stayed home. They had received warning over the phone that there were death threats against them. The only student to go was Elizabeth Eckford, who didn't get the call. A racist mob had gathered in front of the school, and she had to be whisked away by police for protection. From then on, these kids had to go to school via a carpool with a military escort, all because they were black. President Eisenhower had to nationalize the Arkansas National Guard in order that they would comply with US law. Now, try to imagine being one of those 9 students. Every day arriving at school, wading through a sea of people screaming, spitting, and jeering at you, protected from them by only a military escort. Having the National Guard take you from class to class because people could not handle that you were going to a school because you were black. The 9 were bullied by students, harassed, and even some teachers refused to teach them. After 1 year, rather than integrate schools, Little Rock shut down its public school system, and many Southern school systems did the same. A war was on for the future of racial justice in America, and through nonviolent direct action, civil rights groups continued to fight to desegregate the South. The next chapter came in 1958 when the NAACP Youth Council sponsored a sit-in at a lunch counter in Wichita, Kansas. This was an old technique inspired by a sit-in at a segregated library in Alexandria, Virginia in 1939. Often, restaurants and diners, like the lunch counter at the Dockham drugstore, refused to serve people of color save for pickup in the back. A sit-in is when, in violation of that rule, black activists would sit at the counter and demand service, and until they received it, refused to budge. The image of these well-dressed black activists sitting and patiently waiting for a coffee while a swarm of racists screamed, threatened, threw food, and poured drinks on them is one of the iconic moments in American history. After 3 weeks, the drugstore agreed to desegregate their Kansas locations. Another sit-in at a drugstore in Oklahoma City also resulted in a positive outcome. Most famously, in Greensboro, North Carolina, a group of mostly black students led a sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter. This event was a very visible and impactful sit-in. Stories of the Woolworth's sit-ins inspired more across the South. Like the horrific images of Emmett Till, these sit-ins got the attention of the country, and comfortable middle-class white people living outside the South saw what was going on there on television and in the newspapers. By 1960, the practice of sit-ins had spread to nearly every corner of the South, and even a few segregated places in the Midwest, even expanding to beaches, libraries, museums, parks, and theaters. Leaders of these sit-ins came together to coordinate their efforts, founding one of the major organs of the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often referred to as SNCC. They developed new, bigger plans for the next leg of the fight against their oppression. And we will learn about that in a future video on this channel. The 1960s would result in massive demonstrations, monumental legislation, and the radical transformation of a movement which continues to fight for equality to this day. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, but to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have campaigned for the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support through www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership would be greatly appreciated and certainly helps keep the channel going. If you aren't able to provide financial support, please share this video and all of our videos widely and freely. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.